The fire had taken everything. Eloise Morgan pressed her back against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, watching the orange glow consume what remained of her father's Methodist church. The flames licked at the Missouri sky like the devil's own fingers, reaching higher with each passing moment. Black smoke billowed across the prairie, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning timber and something worse, the destruction of 24 years of memories. Her hands trembled as she clutched the only two things she'd managed to save her mother's fiddle, its worn case singed at the edges, and a simple silver ring that had once graced her mother's finger. The heat from the inferno reached her even from this distance, making her skin prickle with sweat despite the cool October night. "Eloise," her father's voice, usually so commanding from the pulpit, now cracked with desperation. "Eloise, where are you?" She couldn't answer, couldn't move. The men who'd done this, the Harlan brothers and their gang, were still out there in the darkness, waiting. She'd heard them laughing as they'd thrown the torches through the church windows. Heard old Jake Harlan's gravelly voice. "That's for preaching against us, Reverend. That's for turning the town against honest folk trying to make a living." Her father had spoken out against their cattle rustling, their intimidation of local farmers. He'd called it sin from his pulpit, urged the congregation to stand against lawlessness. Now the church burned for his righteousness. Through the smoke, she saw her father's silhouette stumbling between the burning buildings of their small compound. The church, the parsonage, the little schoolhouse where she'd taught the town's children their letters. All of it aflame. "Papa," she whispered, but the word died on her lips. To call out would be to reveal her position. The Harlans had made it clear anyone who stood with the Reverend would burn too. A horse whinnied somewhere in the chaos, and she heard gunshots crack through the night. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself lower, trying to become one with the shadows. The fiddle case dug into her side, a painful reminder of her mother dead these 5 years from consumption, buried in the churchyard that was now probably burning too. Time passed in a blur of smoke and fear. Eventually, the shouting died down, replaced by the crash of falling timbers and the whisper crack of flames consuming everything. When dawn finally broke, pale and ghostly through the smoke, Eloise emerged from her hiding place. The church was gone. Where once stood her father's pride, a proper wooden church with real glass windows shipped from St. Louis, now only blackened foundation stones remained. The parsonage, her home since birth, had collapsed into itself, a pile of smoldering ruins. "Papa," she called, her voice hoarse from smoke. "Papa." She found him near what had been the back door of the church, his Sunday coat singed and blackened. He lived, thank the Lord, but barely. His breathing came shallow and ragged, his eyes unfocused when they fluttered open. "Eloise," he whispered. "My dear girl, you're safe." "Don't try to speak. Papa, I'll get help." "No." His hand caught hers with surprising strength. "Listen, your sister, Sarah." Her heart clenched. Sarah had been gone for 2 years now. Sold off, though they'd used prettier words, to a traveling show that had come through town. Their father had arranged it, claiming it was for her own good, that her wildness needed taming. Eloise had never forgiven him for it. "Sarah, in Kansas territory. Find her." His grip loosened. "Tell her, I was wrong. Tell her." But he never finished, his eyes fixed on something beyond her shoulder, beyond the smoke and ruin. And Eloise knew she was alone. She closed his eyes with trembling fingers, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure she believed anymore. Around her, the remnants of her life continued to burn. A few townspeople had begun to gather at a safe distance, but none approached. Fear of the Harlans ran deep. Martha Henderson, who'd always sat in the front pew, caught Eloise's eye and quickly looked away. Tom Bradley, whose son Eloise had taught to read, turned his back entirely. The message was clear. She was poison now, tainted by association. With nowhere else to go and her father's last words echoing in her mind, Eloise made her decision. She would go west to Kansas Territory. She would find Sarah, if her sister still lived, and she would leave this burning ground behind. She salvaged what she could from the ruins. A few coins hidden in a tin box that had somehow survived. A change of clothes from the root cellar. Her father's compass and hunting knife. The fiddle and ring she kept close. Talismans of a life that no longer existed. As she prepared to leave, old Mrs. Whitman approached, one of the few brave enough to defy the Harlans' implicit threat. The elderly woman pressed a small bundle into Eloise's hands. Bread, dried meat, and a water skin. "Child, Mrs. Whitman said quietly, "There's nothing for you here now. Go west, but be careful. The territories are harsh to women alone." "I have no choice," Eloise replied. "No, Mrs." Whitman agreed sadly. "I suppose you don't." As Eloise walked away from the smoking ruins of her life, she didn't look back. Behind her, the sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the destruction. Ahead lay the unknown territories, vast and dangerous. She had her mother's fiddle, her mother's ring, and her father's dying wish. She had been the Reverend's daughter, the school teacher, the good girl who played hymns on Sunday mornings. But fire had a way of changing things, of burning away what you were and leaving only what you might become. The woman who walked toward Kansas Territory was someone new, forged in flame and loss. The October wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke with her for miles. It would cling to her clothes, her hair, her memories. She was Eloise Morgan, daughter of ashes, and she carried her own burning with her into the west. The burnt prairie stretched endlessly before her, a wasteland of ash and blackened grass that crunched beneath her worn boots. 3 days out from Missouri, and Eloise had entered a hell of a different kind. Not the targeted destruction of the Harlans, but nature's own fury. Wildfire had swept through these lands weeks ago, leaving nothing but desolation in its wake. Her water was nearly gone. The last creek she'd found had been choked with ash, undrinkable. Her lips were cracked, her throat parched, and the October sun, though not summer fierce, still drew what little moisture remained from her body. The fiddle case bumped against her back with each step, its weight both burden and comfort. She'd followed the old trader's trail as best she could, but landmarks were gone, consumed by fire. A stand of oaks that should have marked the halfway point to the next settlement was nothing but skeletal remains. The very earth seemed to have been scorched clean of life. By late afternoon, her legs began to fail her. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. The horizon wavered in her vision like water she couldn't reach. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not in this burnt purgatory. Not when she'd survived the Harlans and their torches. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Out here, riders could mean salvation or something worse. She had nothing left to steal except her dignity. But she'd heard enough stories about what happened to women alone on the prairie. Her hand found her father's knife, though she doubted she had the strength to use it. A man materialized from the heat shimmer atop a dust-colored mare. He rode easy in the saddle, like he'd been born to it. But what struck her first was the scar, a wicked burn mark that ran from below his left ear down into his collar. His face was weathered, unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He reined up a good 20 feet away, studying her with gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her soot-stained dress, the fiddle case, the way she swayed on her feet. "You lost?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Walking to Kansas Territory," she managed through cracked lips. "Walking." He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "Through the burn." She nodded, not trusting more words. He reached for his saddlebag, and she tensed, but he only pulled out a canteen. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, like she was a spooked animal. When he held out the water, she had to fight not to snatch it from his hands. "Easy," he said as she drank. "Too fast and you'll lose it all." The water was warm, but clean, and it took all her willpower to sip instead of gulp. He watched her with those storm-gray eyes, taking in details she wished he wouldn't notice. "Name's Wade Callahan," he said finally. "Got a place about 10 miles north, edge of Coal Bend." Eloise Morgan. "Well, Miss Morgan, you won't make Kansas territory. Not like this. Not alone." He glanced at the endless burnt prairie. "Fire took the settlement at Willow Creek. Nothing between here and the territories, but more of the same." Her heart sank. Without Willow Creek, she had no hope of resupplying, no chance of finding her way. "I can't. I have to keep going." "You have to live first." His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "I'm heading back to my place. You can come or you can stay here. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice. Pride warred with survival, and survival won. When he offered his hand to help her mount behind him, she took it. His palm was calloused, strong, and she noticed he was careful not to hold her hand longer than necessary. The ride was awkward. She'd never ridden astride, certainly never pressed against a strange man's back. He smelled of leather and tobacco and something else. Not unpleasant, just male. She tried to hold herself apart, but exhaustion won and she found herself leaning into his warmth. "That fiddle?" he asked once, the first words he'd spoken in miles. "My mother's." He made a sound that might have been understanding and said nothing more. Coal Bend appeared as the sun was setting, a small cluster of buildings huddled against the vast emptiness. Wade's place sat apart from the town proper, a modest cabin with a good-sized barn and corral. It spoke of a man who valued solitude over society. He helped her down, steadying her when her legs buckled. "Can you make it inside?" She nodded, though each step was an effort. The cabin was sparse but clean, a single room with a bed in one corner, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. Bachelor quarters. Clearly, but well kept. "You can have the bed," he said, already pulling blankets from a trunk. "I'll sleep in the barn." "I couldn't." "You could and you will." He set about making a simple meal, beans and salt pork. Nothing fancy, but her stomach clenched with hunger at the smell. "Eat slow," he warned, setting a plate before her. As she ate, she studied him. He moved with economic grace. No wasted motions. The burn scar was more visible in the lamplight, the skin puckered and shiny. He caught her looking and turned away. "Old debt," he said shortly. After the meal, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. He'd laid out clean blankets on the bed, even found what looked like an old shirt she could sleep in. She wanted to protest the kindness. She had no way to repay it, but her body was already betraying her, swaying toward the promised rest. "Why?" she asked as he headed for the door. "Why help me?" He paused, hand on the latch. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Maybe I owe a debt to someone who can't collect. Maybe you're how I pay it." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She changed into the shirt. It smelled of lye soap and cedar, and crawled into the bed. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was her mother's fiddle case propped carefully in the corner, watching over her like a guardian. Outside, she heard him moving around, the quiet sounds of a man seeing to his horse, checking his property. Normal sounds, safe sounds. For the first time in days, she let her guard down completely. She didn't know this Wade Callahan, didn't know what debt he thought he owed or why he lived apart from the town. But he'd given her water when she was dying of thirst, shelter when she had nowhere to go. In the brutal mathematics of the frontier, that made him more trustworthy than anyone in her father's congregation had proved to be. Tomorrow she would have to figure out what came next, how to continue her journey to find Sarah. But tonight, she had a roof over her head and a full stomach, and sometimes that was miracle enough. As sleep pulled her under, she thought she heard the distant sound of a harmonica from the barn, a lonely tune that spoke of other fires, other debts, but perhaps it was only the wind, sighing through the burnt prairie, carrying the ashes of all their yesterdays. The fever came on the second night. Eloise had felt it building throughout the day. The ache in her bones, the way the world seemed to tilt when she stood. She'd tried to hide it, tried to help Wade with simple chores to earn her keep, but by evening she could barely hold herself upright. "You're burning up," Wade said, his hand cool against her forehead. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't noticed when she'd slumped over the table. "I'm fine," she lied, even as shivers racked her body. He made a sound that might have been frustration or concern. "The bed, now." Too weak to argue. She let him guide her to the bed. The room spun as she lay down, and she clutched at the quilt to anchor herself. Through her delirium, she watched him move about the cabin with purpose, stoking the fire, heating water, crushing herbs she couldn't identify. "Burns," she mumbled, lost in memory. "Everything burns." Wade paused in his preparations, then continued without comment. He helped her sit up, held a cup to her lips. The tea was bitter, medicinal, but she drank it down. The night stretched endless. She drifted between waking and sleeping, between present and past. Sometimes she was back in Missouri, watching the church burn. Sometimes she was a child again, her mother teaching her to play the fiddle. The notes seemed to float around her, melody without source. "I'm burning," she heard herself say, the words torn from some deep place. "Don't stop. The music. If it stops, I'll disappear." Strong hands pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "Shh, no one's disappearing." But the fever had its claws in her now, dragging her down into darkness where fire lived. She saw her father's church, saw Sarah being led away by strangers, saw her mother's grave markers consumed by flames that couldn't possibly be real. "Don't stop," she moaned again, though she no longer knew what she was asking for. The cool cloth returned, patient and steady. Wade's voice came from far away. "I'm here, rest now." She wanted to explain about the fire, about the music that lived in her bones, about how she'd failed everyone she'd ever loved. But words were beyond her. All she could do was burn. Sometime in the darkest part of night, she surfaced enough to find him still there, sitting in the chair he'd pulled beside the bed. He'd removed his vest, rolled up his sleeves. In the lamplight, she could see more scars on his forearms, not just burns, but other marks, other stories written in flesh. "Water," she croaked. He helped her drink, supporting her head with surprising gentleness. "The fever's breaking. You'll be all right." Why? The question seemed important, though she couldn't quite grasp why. Why stay? His gray eyes were unreadable in the dim light. "Someone has to—" She wanted to tell him that no one had to do anything, that she'd learned that lesson in flame and ash. But sleep was pulling her under again. And this time it was cooler, calmer, empty of fires. When she woke properly, sunlight was streaming through the cabin window. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, but her mind was clear. Wade was gone. But evidence of his vigil remained. The chair by the bed, a fresh cup of water within reach, a pot of something savory simmering on the stove. She sat up carefully, testing her strength. The world stayed steady. Through the window, she could see him in the corral, working with a horse. The animal was skittish, dancing away from his approach, but he showed infinite patience, standing still until the horse came to him. Her mother's fiddle case caught her eye, still propped in the corner where he'd placed it. Something twisted in her chest. Grief, maybe, or gratitude. She'd been so certain the music had died with everything else. But here it sat, waiting. When Wade came in for the noon meal, she was sitting at the table, wrapped in a blanket despite the day's warmth. "You should be in bed," he said, but without real censure. "I have imposed enough." He served up bowls of stew rabbit, by the smell, with wild onions and potatoes. "You were delirious, talked about fire, about music stopping." Heat that had nothing to do with fever touched her cheeks. "I'm sorry if I said anything." Nothing to apologize for. He sat across from her, and she noticed how he held his spoon, careful, precise, like everything he did. Fever makes us all say things. They ate in silence for a while. Then, surprising herself, she said, "The church burned, back in Missouri. My father's church. That's why I'm going to Kansas Territory to find my sister." He absorbed this without visible reaction. Long way to Kansas Territory. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "Could stay here." The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. He cleared his throat. "What I mean is, Coal Bend could use a school teacher, if you are one." The past tense hurt more than she expected. "But I don't think I'm anything anymore." He studied her with those storm-gray eyes. "Fire doesn't take everything. Sometimes it just changes what's left." His hand moved unconsciously to his scarred neck, and she wondered what fire had taken from him, what it had left behind. "I should go," she said softly. "You've been kind, but I can't." "That fiddle." He nodded toward the case. "You play." The change of subject caught her off guard. I used to. My mother taught me." "Town could use music too." He stood, taking their empty bowls. "Think about it. No rush to decide." As he washed the dishes, she watched the efficient way he moved, the careful distance he maintained even in the small cabin. This was a man who'd learned to live with ghosts. She realized, maybe that's why he'd helped her. He recognized another haunted soul. "The fever," she said suddenly. "You stayed up all night." He shrugged without turning. "Wasn't the first time. Won't be the last." "But why you don't know me? You don't owe me anything." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough. "Maybe that's reason enough. Maybe doing something for someone who can't repay it is the only clean thing left." She thought about that as the afternoon wore on, as he went back to his work and she dozed in the chair, still weak but healing. He was right. Fire didn't take everything. It had taken her home, her father, her place in the world. But it hadn't taken the music in her hands or the stubborn beat of her heart. That night, as he prepared to sleep in the barn again, she called out, "Wade!" He paused at the door. "Thank you for staying, for—" She gestured helplessly, unable to encompass all of it. He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture oddly formal. "Get some rest. Miss Morgan, tomorrow's another day." After he left, she sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind whispered through the grass, and underneath it all, like a promise or a curse, she could hear the faint echo of music waiting to be played again. She'd lost everything to fire, but here, in this sparse cabin with a scarred man's kindness, something else was beginning. Not healing, exactly. The wounds were still too fresh, but maybe the possibility of it, maybe that was enough to start. The old barn stood apart from Wade's cabin, weathered boards silver gray in the morning light. He'd cleared out a corner of the hayloft for her, stringing a rope across for privacy and laying fresh straw beneath clean canvas. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first space that belonged to her since the fire. "It'll be cold come winter," Wade said, surveying his handiwork. "But it's dry and the roof's sound." "It's perfect." She meant it. After sleeping in his bed while he took the barn, having her own space felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. He'd built her a small shelf for her few possessions, and even fashioned a music stand from spare lumber. The gesture touched her more than she could say. He'd noticed how she looked at the fiddle case each morning, like she was gathering courage. 2 weeks had passed since her fever broke. She'd tried to leave twice, but each time Wade had found practical reasons for her to stay. A storm coming in, news of trouble on the trails, the need for another pair of hands with the autumn chores. She suspected he was inventing excuses, but couldn't bring herself to call him on it. The truth was, she wasn't ready to face the vast prairie alone again. Not yet. On her first night in the barn, she finally opened the fiddle case. The instrument lay nestled in worn velvet, untouched by the fires that had taken everything else. Her mother's initials were carved into the tailpiece, E.R.M., Elizabeth Rose Morgan. She lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight. The bow needed rosin, the strings were slack, but it was whole. She spent an hour tuning it, remembering her mother's patient hands guiding hers. When she finally drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged was thin, uncertain. Her fingers had forgotten their places, her wrist its proper angle. The music that had once flowed like water now came in stutters and stops. She was so focused on coaxing melody from memory that she didn't notice the audience gathering outside. It was Wade's horse that alerted her, a whinny that sounded almost questioning. She lowered the fiddle to find not just the bay mare, but a magnificent black stallion she'd never seen before, standing at the barn door like he'd been summoned. "Don't stop on his account," Wade's voice came from the shadows. He stood well back, careful not to spook the animal. "That's Tempest. Been trying to break him for 3 months." The stallion was magnificent and wild, muscles bunched with tension, ready to bolt at any moment, but his ears were pricked forward, focused on her. "He likes music?" she asked. "Seems so." Wade moved slowly into view. "First time he's stood still that long since I brought him in." She raised the fiddle again, self-conscious now but curious. She tried a simple melody, one of the first her mother had taught her. The notes came clearer this time, muscle memory awakening. Tempest took a step forward, then another. His dark eyes never left her, and the wildness in them seemed to soften, just a little. "I'll be damned," Wade murmured. For the next hour, she played everything she could remember. Hymns, folk songs, even a waltz her mother had loved. The stallion stood transfixed, occasionally tossing his head as if keeping time. Wade remained in the doorway, a silent witness to the strange concert. When her unpracticed fingers finally cramped, forcing her to stop, Tempest snorted and shook his mane as if waking from a dream. Then he turned and trotted back to the far pasture, dignity intact. "Never seen anything like it," Wade said. "Music soothes the savage beast, they say, but that," he shook his head. "My mother used to say music was the language everything understood." Eloise carefully placed the fiddle back in its case. "I didn't believe her then." "Play for him again tomorrow." She looked up, surprised by the request. Wade's expression was carefully neutral, but she thought she saw something underneath. Not quite hope, but interest maybe. "If you think it would help." It became their evening ritual. As the sun set, she would climb to her corner of the barn and play. Sometimes Tempest came close. Sometimes he stayed at a distance, but he always listened. Wade would find reasons to work nearby, mending tack, checking the feed stores, never acknowledging that he was listening too. Slowly, her fingers remembered their skill. The music that had felt dead inside her began to stir, tentative but alive. She played her mother's favorites, her father's hymns, the silly ditties she'd taught the school children. Each song was a small act of resurrection. One evening, a week into their routine, Tempest approached close enough to sniff her outstretched hand. "Careful," Wade warned, but she held steady. The stallion's breath was warm on her palm. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that wild thing and wounded woman, connected by trust as fragile as spider's silk. Then Tempest tossed his head and danced away, but the connection had been made. "You've done more in a week than I managed in 3 months, Wade said. "It's not me, it's the music." Maybe. He studied her in that careful way of his. Or maybe it's someone playing music like they mean it. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm rusty." "Not what I meant." He turned to go, then paused. "That waltz you played tonight? Heard it once in San Antonio, before—" He stopped, shook his head. "Play it again tomorrow." After he left, She sat in the quiet barn, processing the almost revelation. Before what? Before the scars, before whatever had driven him to this isolated life. The next morning, over breakfast, they'd fallen into the habit of sharing the morning meal. She gathered courage to ask, "How long have you lived here?" 4 years. He passed her the biscuits, his movements precise as always. "Came out after I left my previous employment." "Which was?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing worth talking about." She recognized the wall and didn't push. They all had their befores that were too painful to examine. "Coal Bend seems like a good town," she offered instead. "Good enough. People leave you alone if you leave them alone." "Is that what you want, to be left alone?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in those gray eyes. "Used to think so." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. She thought he might say more, but the moment passed. He stood, reaching for his hat. "Got to ride into town for supplies. Anything you need?" "Rosin for the bow, if they have it." He nodded and left, but not before she caught what might have been the ghost of a smile. That evening, when she climbed to her barn corner, she found a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was not just rosin, but new strings and a soft cloth for cleaning. No note, but she knew. She played with fresh joy that night, the fiddle singing under her renewed touch. Tempest came closer than ever, and she could have sworn she heard humming from where Wade worked below. The melody rose into the prairie darkness, no longer a lament for what was lost, but something else, tentative, hopeful, alive. Fire had taken her old life, but here in this barn, with a wild horse for an audience and a scarred man's quiet kindness, something new was beginning. She didn't know what to call it yet, didn't dare name it, but it lived in the space between the notes, in the way Tempest trusted her hand, in the way Wade lingered to listen. For now, that was enough. The whispers started at Milligan's general store. Eloise had ventured into Coal Bend with Wade to help carry supplies, her first real trip to town since arriving. She'd worn her best surviving dress, cleaned and mended but still bearing faint smoke stains, and tried to look respectable despite living in a barn. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, president of the Methodist Ladies' Aid Society, was holding court near the fabric counter when they entered, her sharp eyes immediately fixed on Eloise, taking in every detail from her unchaperoned state to the way Wade guided her through the door with a light touch on her elbow. "Well, Mrs. Fletcher said, loud enough to carry, "I see, Mr. Callahan has found himself a companion." The other women tittered. Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her head high, remembering her mother's teachings about dignity in the face of gossip. "Morning, Mrs. Fletcher," Wade said evenly, touching his hat brim. His tone was polite but held warning. Mr. Callahan?" The woman's smile was sharp as broken glass. "And this must be the young woman from the burned church we've heard about. How fortunate that you found shelter." The way she said shelter made it sound like something scandalous. Eloise opened her mouth to explain, but Wade's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her elbow. "Miss Morgan is recovering from her ordeal," he said. "The Christian thing to do." "Of course." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes glittered, though one wonders why she hasn't sought more. Appropriate accommodations. Surely the church could— "The lady's business is her own," Wade cut in, steel beneath the words. They completed their shopping in tense silence. Mr. Milligan serving them with professional courtesy, but obvious discomfort. Eloise could feel the women's eyes following her, heard the whispers resume as soon as they moved away. Outside, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm causing you trouble." Nothing I haven't handled before. But his jaw was tight, and she noticed how his hand moved unconsciously to his scarred neck. Maybe I should find other— "No." The word came out harder than he probably intended. He stopped walking, faced her. Unless you want to, but not because of a few bored women with nothing better to do than wag their tongues. That evening, the situation worsened. Reverend Josiah Palmer appeared at Wade's gate, a thin man with the bearing of someone who believed his collar gave him authority over souls and circumstances alike. Mr. Callahan, he began without preamble. I've come about the young woman. Wade, who'd been repairing a harness on the porch, didn't look up. What about her? The impropriety of the situation cannot be ignored. An unmarried woman, living on your property. In the barn, Wade clarified. With her own space, nothing improper about it. Nevertheless, the appearance... Reverend. Wade finally looked up, and something in his eyes made the minister take a step back. The lady came here half dead from walking through burned prairie. I gave her shelter. If your Christian charity extends only to those who can pay pew rent, that's between you and your God. Palmer's face flushed. The town council has concerns. Then let the town council come tell me themselves. Wade returned to his work. Dismissal clear. But the town council did come. 3 days later, Mayor Thomas Hartwell, Sheriff Jed Nally, and 2 other prominent merchants stood in Wade's yard like they were conducting official business. Eloise watched from the barn, her stomach knotting. She'd brought this on him. This scrutiny he'd clearly worked hard to avoid. Callahan. The mayor began, attempting authority despite being a head shorter than Wade. We need to discuss the situation with your guest. Nothing to discuss, Wade said. He'd been chopping wood, and didn't stop, the axe falling in steady rhythm. Sheriff Nally stepped forward. He was a big man, gone to fat but still powerful, with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, those eyes fixed on Eloise in the barn doorway. And something flickered across his face. The girl, he said slowly. She's got a look about her, familiar-like. Wade's axe paused mid-swing. Lots of people look familiar. True enough. Nally rubbed his jaw. But I've got a good memory for faces. There was a woman went missing from a traveling show about 5 years back. Medicine show. They called it, though what they were selling wasn't nothing medicinal. Young woman, they said, pretty, played the fiddle. Eloise's blood turned cold. Sarah. He was talking about Sarah. This girl's from Missouri, Wade said evenly. Church folk. Her father was a minister. That's so. Nally's eyes never left Eloise. Funny thing, though, that missing girl word was she had family in Missouri. Religious folk who'd sold her off to settle debts, then had second thoughts. That's enough. Wade set down the axe, moved to stand between Nally and Eloise's line of sight. The lady's been through enough without your wild tales. No tale, Nally said. Just observation. Course, that missing girl would be older now, and if she'd had a sister... He let the implication hang. Mayor Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. The point is, Callahan, we need to know who we're harboring in our town. For all we know, she could be running from the law, or... She's running from nothing but grief, Wade said, his voice gone dangerously quiet. Her home burned. Her father died. She's got no one and nowhere. If that's a crime in Coal Bend, then maybe it's the town that needs examining, not her. Now see here, one of the merchants began. No, you see, Wade took a step forward, and the men instinctively backed up. The lady stays as long as she needs. She's causing no harm, breaking no laws, and if I hear any man speaking ill of her reputation, we'll settle it in a way you won't like. The threat hung in the air like smoke. These men knew Wade's reputation, Eloise realized, knew he was dangerous when pushed, even if they didn't know the specifics of his past. There's no need for unpleasantness, Mayor Hartwell said quickly. We simply wanted to ensure... You've ensured it. Now get off my land. They left, but Sheriff Nally looked back once, his eyes finding Eloise again. The calculation in that look made her shiver. That night, over a tent supper, she finally spoke. The sheriff. What he said about a missing girl? Wade pushed his food around his plate. You don't have to tell me anything. My sister Sarah. She was sold to a traveling show when she was 15. My father, he called it an apprenticeship. Said it would teach her discipline. But we all knew what it really was. The words tasted bitter. I tried to stop it. Failed. You were what? 19, 20. Not much you could have done. I could have gone with her. Could have fought harder. She set down her fork. That's why I was going to Kansas Territory. To find her. And if the sheriff's right, if she was the one who went missing, then she escaped. Hope and fear warred in her chest. And she might need help. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then, we'll deal with that when we need to. For now, let them talk. They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. But Eloise wasn't sure. The way Sheriff Nally had looked at her, like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. This wasn't over. I'm trouble for you, she said softly. Maybe I should... Stop. He looked at her directly. You're not trouble. You're a woman trying to survive in a world that makes that harder than it should be. I've got no patience for those who'd make it harder still. The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised them both. He cleared his throat, looked away. Besides, Tempest would never forgive me if his musician left. Despite everything, she smiled. Just Tempest. He almost smiled back. Finish your supper. And tomorrow, maybe you could play in town. Show them you're not some scandalous woman, but a proper musician. It was a risk. She knew. Drawing more attention to herself when the sheriff was already suspicious. But hiding would only fuel more gossip. And maybe, just maybe, if Sarah was out there somewhere, word of a fiddle-playing woman in Coal Bend might reach her. All right, she agreed. But only if you're there. Where else would I be? The simple question, asked without thought, carried more weight than either of them was ready to acknowledge. But it was true. Somehow, in just a few weeks, they developed a partnership of sorts. Two damaged souls, finding shelter in each other's company. The town could whisper all it wanted. What they had might not be proper by Coal Bend standards, but it was honest. And after all the lies and losses, honest was enough. The Harvest Festival filled Coal Bend's main street with lanterns and laughter. Farmers celebrated a decent crop despite the summer's drought, and merchants hawked their wares from decorated stalls. At the center of it all, a great bonfire would be lit come full dark, around which the dancing would begin. Eloise stood in the barn, staring at her reflection in Wade's small shaving mirror. She'd done her best with her appearance, hair pinned properly, her least damaged dress pressed with a borrowed iron. But she still looked like what she was, a woman who'd lost everything and was trying to piece together something from the ashes. You'll do fine, Wade said from the doorway. He'd dressed in his best too, a clean white shirt, dark vest, string tie. The formal clothes made him look younger somehow, despite the scar at his throat. The whole town will be watching. Let them watch. He offered his arm. Ready? She wasn't, but she took his arm anyway. The solid warmth of him steadied her nerves as they walked toward town, her fiddle case in her other hand. The festival was already in full swing when they arrived. Children ran between the stalls with candied apples, their laughter bright as bell chimes. The air smelled of roasting corn, spiced cider, and wood smoke, though that last made her tense until Wade's hand covered hers on his arm, a silent reminder that this was different fire, celebration, not destruction. They drew stares immediately. Eloise felt the weight of eyes, heard the whispers ripple outward from their passing, but Wade walked steady and sure, nodding to those who acknowledged him, ignoring those who didn't. Miss Morgan, a young voice called out. Timothy Brennan, the blacksmith's boy, ran up with a gap-toothed grin. Are you going to play your fiddle Ma says you might play for the dancing? I might, she said, managing a smile. At least the children hadn't learned to be suspicious yet. The mayor intercepted them near the platform where the musicians were setting up. "Callahan, Miss Morgan." His politician's smile was strained. "I trust there won't be any unpleasantness this evening." "Not from us," Wade said evenly. Sheriff Nally stood nearby, watching with those calculating eyes. But there were other looks too, curious, even welcoming. Not everyone in Coal Bend had decided against her. When the call went out for musicians, Eloise's hands trembled as she mounted the platform. 2 other fiddlers were already there, along with a banjo player and someone with a concertina. They looked at her with professional interest rather than moral judgment. "What do you play, miss?" asked the elder fiddler, a weathered man named Samuel Potts. "Whatever's needed," she replied. "Good answer. We'll start with Turkey in the Straw. Move into some reels. You know, Devil's Dream." Despite the name, she did. Her mother had taught her, laughing at the irony of a minister's wife playing such a tune. "I know it." As she rosined her bow, she caught Wade's eye in the crowd. He'd positioned himself where she could see him easily, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to avoid seeming possessive. The careful distance they always maintained. Even now, the first notes rose into the evening air, and everything else fell away. Her nervousness, the watching crowd, the weight of judgment, none of it mattered once the music began. She followed Samuel's lead, her fiddle joining the melody like she'd been playing with these men for years. By the second tune, people were dancing. By the third, even some of the suspicious faces had softened, feet tapping despite themselves. Music was the great equalizer. Her mother had always said, hard to hate someone when they're helping you dance. During a break between sets, she noticed Wade talking with a young woman near the cider stand. Pretty, blonde, respectable looking. Everything Eloise wasn't anymore. The woman laughed at something he said, touching his arm lightly, and something twisted in Eloise's chest. "That's Clara Henshaw," Samuel said, following her gaze. "Been trying to catch Callahan's eye for 2 years now. Her PA owns the bank." Eloise made herself look away. "She's very pretty." "Pretty enough. But Callahan's never shown interest. Course, that was before." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. When the dancing resumed, Mayor Hartwell himself called for partners for a Virginia reel. Wade appeared at the platform's edge, hand extended. "I don't know if that's wise," she said quietly. "Probably isn't." But his hand remained steady, waiting. She set down her fiddle and took his hand, letting him help her down. The crowd parted as he led her to the line of dancers, whispers following like ripples in water. "I should warn you," he said as they took their positions. "I'm a terrible dancer." "Liar," she said, and was rewarded with almost a smile. He wasn't terrible. He was careful, controlled, moving through the figures with the same precision he brought to everything. When the dance called for him to swing her, his hands were gentle but sure. When they came together in the center, she could smell leather and soap and something uniquely him. "People are staring," she murmured as they promenaded down the line. "Let them." "It'll make things worse for you." "Maybe I don't care." The dance separated them before she could respond. When they came together again, she found herself studying his face in the firelight. The scar was less noticeable in the dancing shadows, and she could see what he might have looked like before. Handsome in a rough way, with those storm-gray eyes and strong jaw. "What?" he asked, catching her look. "Nothing, just thank you for this." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "You're the one doing me a favor. First time in 4 years anyone's gotten me to dance." The set ended too soon. As he escorted her back to the platform, she noticed Clara Henshaw watching with poorly concealed disappointment. Sheriff Nally watched too, but his expression was harder to read. She played 2 more sets, the music flowing easier now. During Amazing Grace, even misses, Fletcher stopped glaring long enough to dab at her eyes. Music might not heal everything, but it could soften even the hardest hearts, at least temporarily. As the bonfire burned down to embers and the crowd began to thin, Wade helped her pack up her fiddle. They'd survived the evening without major incident, even earned some grudging respect. It felt like a small victory. "Miss Morgan." Sheriff Nally's voice stopped them as they turned to leave. "Fine playing tonight." "Thank you, Sheriff." Reminded me of someone I heard once, down in San Antonio. Medicine show that came through about 5 years back. His eyes were sharp, probing. "You ever been to Texas?" "No, sir." It wasn't quite a lie. She'd never been there. He studied her a moment longer. "Well, you have a good evening now." They walked home in silence, the festival sounds fading behind them. At the barn, Wade paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Eloise," he said, and her name in his voice made her breath catch. "Whatever the sheriff thinks he knows." "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "No, listen." He faced her fully, moonlight casting half his face in shadow. "Everyone's got things they're running from. God knows I do. But you don't have to run anymore. Not if you don't want to." The words hung between them, weighted with promise. She wanted to step closer, wanted to ask what he was really saying, but a lifetime of propriety held her back. Even now, when propriety had already failed her. "Wade, You don't have to answer now." He touched his hat brim, the formal gesture at odds with the intensity in his eyes. "Just think about it." He left her standing in the barn door, fiddle case clutched to her chest like armor. Inside, she could hear Tempest nickering softly, as if asking where his evening concert was. She climbed to her loft and sat in the dark, replaying the evening, the way Wade had danced with her, shielding her from the worst of the gossip with his presence, the way he'd said her name, like it meant something more than just identification. Through her small window, she could see a light still burning in his cabin. Was he sitting up, wrestling with the same thoughts? Or was she reading too much into simple kindness? She didn't know, but for the first time since the fire, she wanted to stay somewhere long enough to find out. The truth came on a cold November morning, carried by the wind through the barn's open door. Eloise was mending a harness when she heard the horses, too many for ordinary travelers. She peered through a crack in the wall and saw 5 riders approaching Wade's property, their bearing speaking of hard miles and harder purposes. Wade emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand but pointed down. His body language was calm, but she'd learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself with cover nearby. "Callahan," the lead rider called out, a big man with iron-gray hair and a face carved from granite. "Been a long time." "Not long enough." "Bishop." Wade's voice carried warning. Bishop? The name stirred something in Eloise's memory. Some half-heard story from her father's discussions of border troubles and violent men. Now, is that any way to greet old friends? Bishop dismounted, his men following suit. They spread out slightly, not quite threatening, but ready. "We rode a long way to find you. I told you 4 years ago, I'm done. Nobody's ever done. Wade, you know that." Bishop's eyes swept the property, lingering on the barn. "Besides, this isn't about old times. It's about settling debts. I don't owe you anything." "Not me," Bishop smiled, and it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. "But there's a certain Reverend's family in Missouri might disagree. Family of a man who died because of information you provided." Eloise's blood turned to ice. "No, it couldn't be." "That wasn't supposed to happen," Wade said, and she heard something break in his voice. "The Harlans were only supposed to run him out, not burn down his church with him in it." Bishop laughed. "Come now. Wade, you knew what kind of men the Harlans were. What did you think would happen when you told them the Reverend was planning to testify against their operation?" The world tilted. Eloise gripped the harness leather until her knuckles went white, fighting the urge to be sick. "Wade, Wade had caused her father's death. The man who'd saved her, sheltered her, made her feel safe again. He was the reason she'd lost everything. "That's old business," Wade said. "Why bring it up now?" "Because we need you for one last job. Big payoff, enough to set us all up proper." Bishop's voice turned harder. "And if you refuse, well, that pretty little fiddler in your barn might be interested to know how her daddy really died, assuming she doesn't already know." Wade went very still. "Leave her out of this." "Oh ho, like that is it? Wade Callahan's finally got himself a woman?" Bishop's grin widened. "Even better. See, we did some checking. That girl's the Reverend's daughter, isn't she? The one who disappeared after the fire must be real cozy, sharing your bed with the daughter of a man you got killed." "She doesn't share my bed." The words came out sharp as breaking glass. "Maybe not yet, but you want her to, don't you?" Bishop moved closer. "Here's what's going to happen. Wade, you're going to ride out with us tomorrow. Do this one job, or I'm going to have a real interesting conversation with Miss Morgan about her father's death. And if I do the job, then we disappear. Your secret stays buried." Bishop remounted. "Think on it. Wade, we'll be back at dawn for your answer." They rode off, leaving dust and devastation in their wake. Wade stood frozen in the yard, still gripping the rifle. Then, slowly, he turned toward the barn. Eloise met him at the door. She knew her face must show everything. The shock, the betrayal, the horrible understanding of why he'd helped her, why he'd talked about debts that couldn't be repaid. "Eloise, is it true?" Her voice came out stranger than she expected. Did you tell them where to find my father?" He set the rifle aside carefully, like it might shatter. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it." The words ripped from her throat. "Explain how you didn't cause my father's death." "I can't." His shoulders sagged. "Because I did not the way Bishop made it sound. But yes, I gave the Harlans information. I thought they'd just run him out of town. Not—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I was working for Bishop then, gathering information, keeping the gang one step ahead of the law. Your father was going to testify. Would have exposed the whole network. So I told them, you were a criminal." It wasn't a question. "Worse than that, I was good at it." He met her eyes, and she saw the full weight of his self-loathing. "Good at reading people, at finding their weaknesses, good at staying detached, until what?" "Until I saw what the Harlans did. Saw that church burn." His hand moved unconsciously to his scarred neck. "I tried to stop it. That's how I got this Jake Harlan's lesson about changing sides midstream. By the time I got free, it was too late. Your father was already dead." The word fell between them like a stone. "He died because of you." Yes. The simple admission broke something in her. She'd expected excuses, justifications, not this raw acceptance of guilt. "Is that why you helped me guilt?" "At first." He took a step closer, stopped when she backed away. "At first, yes, when I saw you half dead on the prairie, I thought, I don't know, maybe I could balance the scales somehow. But then what? Then I got to know you, heard you play, watched you bring music back into the world after losing everything." His voice roughened. "And I realized I wasn't helping you out of guilt anymore. I was doing it because I couldn't stand the thought of you hurting more than you already had." "Don't," she wrapped her arms around herself. "Don't you dare make this about feelings, not now." "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Eloise, I know there isn't any for what I did." He looked older suddenly, worn down by the weight of his crimes. "But I won't do Bishop's job. I won't go back to that life, not even to keep the secret." "Why not? You've already destroyed one family. What's a little more blood on your hands?" He flinched like she'd struck him. "Because you showed me I could be better than that, even if you hate me now, even if you leave, and you should leave. I won't go backwards." I don't know what to do. The admission came out small. Lost. I should hate you. I want to hate you. But you saved my life, and you've been nothing but kind. And I don't know how to reconcile that with what you've just told me. You don't have to. Pack your things. Take Buttercup, the mare. I'll give you money, supplies. Whatever you need to get to Kansas territory safely. Find your sister. Forget you ever knew me. And Bishop. Let me worry about Bishop. She studied him, this man who'd sheltered her, who'd danced with her despite the gossip, who'd given her space to heal, the man who'd caused her father's death. How could he be both? I need time, she said finally, to think. Take all the time you need. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. Give you the cabin. Easier for you to pack. He gathered a few things and left her alone. She stood in his simple home, surrounded by evidence of the quiet life he'd built, books on the shelf, the extra cup he'd bought for their morning coffee, the music stand he'd made for her. Everything felt different now, tainted by knowledge she wished she didn't have, but underneath the betrayal, a small voice whispered he could have lied. Bishop was gone. Wade could have sent them away and kept his secret. Instead, he'd told her the truth, knowing it would destroy whatever was growing between them. Through the window, she could see light in the barn. Was he with Tempest, the wild horse he'd been so patient with? Like he was trying to prove that violent things could be gentled, that damage could be overcome. She touched her mother's ring, seeking guidance that wouldn't come. Tomorrow, Bishop would return. Tomorrow, she would have to decide, leave the man who destroyed her old life but given her a new one, or stay and face whatever came next. The fire had taken everything once. Now she had to decide what was worth salvaging from these new ashes, or whether to walk away and let it all burn behind her. The smoke was visible from 5 miles out, a black column rising into the crystalline November sky like a finger of judgment. Eloise had been in town when the cry went up. Fire on the North Ridge, prairie fire. She'd run back to find Wade already loading the wagon with barrels of water, wet blankets, shovels. His face was grim as he worked, and she realized with a chill that the North Ridge was exactly where they'd need to go to escape to higher ground. How bad? She asked, grabbing tools without being asked. The revelation about her father still sat between them like a wound, but fire waited for no one's personal pain. Bad. Wind's pushing it straight for Coal Bend. He glanced at her, something flickering in his gray eyes. You should go with the others evacuating south. I'm not leaving. The words came out fiercer than intended. She still hadn't decided what to do about Bishop, about Wade, about any of it. But she wouldn't run while others fought. Sheriff Nally rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. Callahan, we need every able body. Fire's moving fast, already took the Hendricks place. How many souls made it out? Wade asked. All of them. Thank God. But if we don't create a firebreak, the whole town's done for. Wade looked at the sheriff, then at the smoke-darkened sky. The old Comanche trail through Dead Man's Pass. If we can get everyone through there to the northern plateau, that's suicide. Nally interrupted. That trail hasn't been used in years, and with fire on both sides. It's the only ground high enough and clear enough to be safe, unless you've got a better idea. The sheriff's silence was answer enough. Within an hour, Coal Bend was in full evacuation. Wagons loaded with belongings, children crying, men shouting orders. Wade took charge like he'd been born to it, organizing groups, directing traffic, his criminal past forgotten in the face of immediate need. Women and children first up the trail, he commanded. Men, we form a line here. Try to slow the fire's advance. Buy them time. Eloise helped load the elderly and infirm into wagons. Mrs. Fletcher, who'd been so cutting about propriety, now clutched Eloise's hand with desperate gratitude as she helped her into a wagon bed. Bless you, dear, the old woman whispered. The fire was visible now, a writhing orange wall consuming everything in its path. The sound was like nothing Eloise had ever heard, a roaring, crackling monster that devoured the world. Eloise Wade caught her arm as she helped the last child into a wagon. "Go with them, please." "No." She met his eyes steadily. "I've run from enough fires. Not this time." Something passed across his face. Pride, fear, resignation. "Then stay close. No heroics." They worked the fire break as the evacuees climbed the treacherous trail. Eloise's hands blistered as she dug, but she didn't stop. Around her, men who'd whispered about her reputation now worked beside her without comment. Fire was the great equalizer. "It's jumping the brake," someone shouted. Wade cursed. The wind had picked up, carrying embers across their carefully dug line. Spot fires erupted in the grass beyond. "Fall back," Wade ordered. "Everyone to the trail." The retreat was chaos. The fire seemed to chase them, leaping from grass clump to grass clump with terrifying speed. The trail entrance was a bottleneck, people pushing, fear taking over. "One at a time," Wade roared, physically holding back the crowd. "Panic will kill us faster than fire." They climbed. The old Comanche trail was narrow, treacherous, carved into the hillside with steep drops on one side and rock face on the other. Below them, the fire raged. Above, the evacuees struggled upward, too slowly. Halfway up, disaster. A wagon wheel slipped, the whole conveyance tilting toward the edge. The family inside screamed. Wade didn't hesitate. He scrambled across the loose rock, grabbing the wagon tongue just as it started to go over. The muscles in his arms corded as he held it, but he couldn't pull it back alone. Eloise found herself beside him, adding her strength to his. Others joined them, and together they hauled the wagon to safety. The family tumbled out, weeping with relief. "Keep moving," Wade shouted. The fire had reached the base of the trail now, smoke billowing up, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. People coughed, stumbled. A child fell, and Eloise scooped him up, carrying him when his legs gave out. Near the top, the trail widened slightly where it passed through a cleft in the rock. This was the place Wade had fought for his life once before. She realized where he'd gotten his scars trying to save others. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Almost there," he encouraged the stragglers. "Just a little farther." Then she heard it, a cry from below. Through the smoke, she could barely make out a figure on the trail. Someone who'd fallen behind. It was Clara Henshaw, the banker's daughter, her ankle clearly injured. Wade saw her at the same moment. Without a word, he started back down. "Wade, no!" Eloise grabbed for him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the smoke. The wait was agony. The fire climbed the hillside, eating the vegetation that clung to the rocky slope. If it reached the trail before Wade returned, then, through the inferno's glow, she saw them. Wade half carrying Clara, both of them coughing, clothes singed. The fire was right behind them. So close Eloise could see the flames reflected in Wade's eyes. "Go!" he shouted. "Get to the top!" But Eloise stood her ground at the cleft, reaching for them as they stumbled the last few yards. She grabbed Clara, pulling her through as Wade pushed from behind. They tumbled onto the plateau just as the fire roared through the pass they'd just vacated. For a moment, they lay there gasping. Around them, the townspeople huddled on the rocky plateau, watching their town's fate play out below. Some buildings would survive. The fire was already slowing as it hit the cleared areas around the settlement, but the prairie was black and smoking as far as the eye could see. "You came back for me," Clara whispered to Wade, her pretty face streaked with soot and tears. "You saved my life." Wade helped her sit up, checking her ankle with the gentle hands. Anyone would have done the same. But Eloise knew that wasn't true. The same man who'd caused her father's death had just risked everything to save someone who meant nothing to him. The contradiction made her heart ache. As the immediate danger passed and people began to settle in for a long, cold night on the plateau, Wade found Eloise sitting apart, her mother's fiddle case clutched in her arms. one of the few possessions she'd managed to save. "You should have gone when I told you," he said, sitting beside her with a careful distance between them. "I'm not good at doing what I'm told." She studied his profile, lit by the dying fires below. "Bishop will be back tomorrow." "I know. What will you do?" "Tell him no. Face whatever comes." "He'll tell everyone. About my father. About what you were." "Probably." He turned to her then, and she saw he'd accepted his fate. "But I won't go back to that life. Not for him, not for anyone. You showed me I could be better than my worst mistakes. That's worth whatever price I have to pay." The words hung between them like smoke. Around them, people were settling in, sharing blankets, comforting children. The banker was fussing over Clara, shooting grateful looks at Wade. Sheriff Nally was organizing watches, preparing for the long night ahead. "I'm still angry," Eloise said quietly. "About my father. Part of me may always be angry." "You should be." "But," she took a breath, tasting ash and truth. "You're not the same man who made that choice. Are you?" "I want to believe I'm not, but wanting doesn't make it true." She thought about the last weeks, his patience with Tempest, his kindness to her, the way he'd stood between her and the town's judgment, the way he'd risked his life tonight for people who'd whispered behind his back. "I think," she said slowly, "that we are what we choose to be in the moments that matter. And tonight, when it mattered, you chose to be the man who runs toward the fire instead of away from it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that tomorrow, when Bishop comes, you won't face him alone." She met his eyes. "I'm saying that maybe redemption isn't about balancing scales or paying debts. Maybe it's about choosing to be better, every day, even when it costs everything." "Eloise," his voice broke on her name. "I'm not saying I forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Completely." She shifted closer, just slightly. "But I'm saying I'll stand with you, because the man who saved me on the prairie, who gave me shelter, who danced with me despite the gossip, that's who you choose to be now, and that man is worth saving." He reached for her hand, stopped just short of touching. She closed the distance, intertwining their fingers. His hand was rough, scarred from tonight's fresh burns and older wounds. But his grip was gentle. "I don't deserve... None of us deserve anything." She cut him off. "We're all just ashes and choices. Wade. But if we're lucky, we find someone willing to see past the ashes to the choices that matter." Below them, coal bins smoldered but stood. Above them, stars emerged through the smoke. And there, on the plateau, surrounded by their neighbors, their community. Eloise held the hand of the man who'd destroyed her old life. It wasn't forgiveness. Not quite. But it was a beginning. "Play something," a small voice piped up. One of the children, huddled with his family nearby. "Please, Miss Eloise, music makes the scary go away." She looked at Wade, then at her fiddle case. Tomorrow would bring Bishop and his threats, choices and consequences. But tonight, they were alive. They'd walked through fire and emerged on the other side. She took out her fiddle and began to play, not a lament this time, but a song of hope. The notes rose into the smoky air, and, one by one, voices joined in. Even Wade, who she'd never heard sing, added his rough baritone to the chorus. They sang on that burnt mountain, their voices defying the darkness, and Eloise thought that maybe this was what grace looked like, not the absence of sin or the erasure of wrongs, but the choice to find beauty in the ashes, to build something new where the old had burned away. The sun rose over a transformed landscape, where golden prairie had stretched to the horizon. Now black earth dominated, still smoking in places. But Coalbend had survived, and as the townspeople descended from the plateau, a different spirit moved among them. Eloise watched from Wade's porch as neighbors who'd barely spoken before now worked side by side, clearing debris, sharing what supplies remained. The fire had burned away more than grass. It had consumed old grudges, petty jealousies, the luxury of judgment. Miss Morgan, Mayor Hartwell approached, hat in hand, soot still streaking his face. I wanted to thank you. What you did yesterday, staying to help fight the fire, helping with the evacuation. Well, ma'am, we're grateful. Behind him stood others. Mrs. Fletcher, several merchants, even some who'd whispered the loudest about her improper living situation. Their faces showed a humility born of shared survival. We all did what was needed, Eloise replied quietly. Yes, but... The mayor cleared his throat. What I mean to say is, we'd be honored if you'd consider teaching our children. The schoolhouse is gone, but we can rebuild. The town needs... That is, we need people like you. People who stay when times are hard. Before she could respond, hoofbeats announced unwelcome visitors. Bishop and his 4 men rode into the yard like they owned it, their clothes clean and pressed in stark contrast to the soot-stained townspeople. Wade emerged from the cabin, and Eloise noticed he was wearing his gun, something he rarely did around the property. Made your decision. Callahan, Bishop's voice carried across the yard. I have? Wade stepped off the porch, positioning himself between Bishop and everyone else. The answer is no. Bishop's smile was cold. That's unfortunate. Boys, why don't you tell these good folks about their hero here, about how he used to gather information for us, how a certain reverend in Missouri died because of me. Wade's voice cut through clear and strong. Yes, I gave you information about Reverend Morgan. Yes, he died because of it. That's my burden to carry. Gasps rippled through the gathered townspeople. Eloise saw shock, confusion, the beginning of renewed suspicion. But Wade wasn't finished. 4 years ago, I was a different man. I did things I'm not proud of, things that haunt me every day. But I left that life, came here to try to be better. He looked at the townspeople, meeting their eyes one by one. I won't claim to be a good man, but I'm trying to be, and I won't go back to what I was. Not for threats, not for money, not for anything. Touching speech, Bishop drawled. But these people deserve to know exactly what kind of man they're harboring. Should I tell them about Tucson, about what happened to that family who wouldn't sell their water rights? That was you, Wade said firmly. I left before Tucson. Whatever you did there, it's on your head, not mine. Bishop's face darkened. You always were too soft. That's why I'm giving you one last chance. Come with us. Or what? Sheriff Nally stepped forward, hand on his pistol. You'll shoot up our town after what we've just been through. This isn't your business. Sheriff, it is now. Nally moved to stand beside Wade. Man's past is his past. What matters is who he is today. And yesterday, Wade Callahan risked his life to save this town. That's the man I know. One by one, others stepped forward. The banker whose daughter Wade had saved, the families he'd helped evacuate, even Mrs. Fletcher, chin high despite her previous disapproval. You'll have to go through all of us, someone called out. Bishop's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped as he realized the reality. These weren't scared townspeople anymore. They were survivors, forged in fire, united in purpose. This isn't over, Callahan, Bishop snarled. Yes, it is. Wade's voice was steady. You can spread stories about my past from here to Mexico. Won't change anything. These people know who I am now. That's what matters. Bishop looked around, calculating odds. Whatever he saw in the faces surrounding him made him curse and wheel his horse around. You'll regret this, he called over his shoulder. All of you. They watched until the riders disappeared into the distance. Only then did Wade turn to face his neighbors, shoulders squared for their judgment. It was Clara Henshaw who spoke first. Mr. Callahan, she said softly. I don't care what you were before. You came back for me in that fire. That's all I need to know about your character. Others nodded, murmuring agreement, not everyone. Some faces showed lingering doubt, questions that would need time to answer. But enough to matter. Sheriff Nally extended his hand. Town could use a man with your skills. Callahan, officially. I mean, if you're interested. Wade stared at the offered hand, then slowly reached out to shake it. I'll think about it. As the crowd dispersed, returning to the work of rebuilding, Mayor Hartwell lingered. Miss Morgan, about the teaching position. I accept, Eloise said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Coal Bend is my home now. The mayor smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Welcome home, then. That evening, Wade rebuilt the music stand in the barn, though Eloise had told him she'd be moving into the small room behind where the schoolhouse would be rebuilt, a proper arrangement that would silence any remaining gossips. You don't have to leave, he said quietly, not looking at her as he worked. Yes, I do. You know I do. She watched his careful hands shaping the wood. But I'm not going far. He nodded, understanding. They'd weathered the crisis, faced down the past. But that didn't erase the complexity between them. Her father was still dead because of choices Wade had made. That truth would always exist between them, even as other truths grew alongside it. Eloise, he began, then stopped. I know, she said softly. I know what you want to say, and maybe someday, but not yet. I need time, Wade. Time to figure out how to hold both truths, who you were and who you are. That's fair. He set down his tools, finally meeting her eyes. More than fair. I'll wait, long as it takes. That night, she played in the barn one last time. Tempest came close, now gentle enough to nuzzle her hand. The stallion had been transformed by patience and music. Wildness channeled into strength rather than fear. Maybe people could transform too. As she played, she heard voices from outside, townspeople stopping by to check on each other, sharing food, making plans for rebuilding, community born from catastrophe. She thought of her father, wondered what he would make of her choices. Would he understand that sometimes redemption came in unexpected forms, that the man who'd caused his death had become the man who saved others? She didn't know, but she knew what her mother would say, that music was the language everything understood, that grace appeared in the spaces between the notes. Wade appeared in the doorway, keeping his usual careful distance. Bishop might come back, might try to make trouble. Let him try. She lowered the fiddle. This town faced down a wildfire. A few bitter men don't seem so frightening after that. You're staying, then really staying. I came here looking for my sister. I still want to find her someday. But... She gestured at the barn, the yard beyond where Wade had given her shelter. The town that had become home despite its initial rejection. Maybe I needed to find myself first. Maybe I needed to learn that you can build something new from ashes. Eloise, tomorrow I start teaching again, she interrupted gently. Children who've just lived through terror, who need to believe the world can be safe and good again. You're going to help the sheriff keep the town safe. We're both choosing to build instead of burn. She packed her fiddle carefully, gathered her few possessions. At the door, she paused. Thank you, she said, for saving me, in all the ways you've saved me. His voice was rough when he answered. You saved me too, showed me I could be more than my worst choices. We saved each other. Then, she managed a small smile. That's what people do, isn't it, when they care about each other? She left before he could respond, but she heard his whispered, yes, carry on the night wind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, teaching traumatized children, rebuilding a town, navigating whatever grew between her and Wade. But tonight, she walked through the darkness unafraid. Behind her, music drifted from the barn, Wade's harmonica, playing the waltz she'd taught him. It was hesitant, imperfect, but it was his, another soul learning to make beauty from whatever remained. The fire had taken so much, but in its wake, They were all discovering what could grow in scorched earth when people chose courage over fear, community over isolation, hope over ash. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she was choosing. And for now, that was enough. Spring came to Coal Bend like a promise kept, where fire had blackened the earth. Wildflowers now bloomed in impossible profusion, Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, and bluebonnets carpeting the land in defiant color. The schoolhouse had been rebuilt, larger than before, with real glass windows that caught the morning light. Eloise stood before her class, 23 children ranging from 6 to 16, all still bearing the invisible marks of the fire, but healing, day by day. On her desk sat a vase of wildflowers that appeared each Monday without fail, though Wade never acknowledged leaving them. 6 months had passed since the fire. 6 months of careful distance and cautious hope, of stolen glances and conversations that danced around what couldn't yet be said. Wade had accepted the deputy position, bringing order to Coal Bend with the same quiet strength he brought to everything. Bishop hadn't returned, though rumors placed him in Mexico, running from troubles of his own making. This afternoon was special. The children were preparing for the spring festival, and Eloise had taught them a new song. As their voices rose in harmony, she saw Wade pause outside the window on his rounds, listening, always listening, even when he tried to pretend he wasn't. After school, she found him at his property, working on something in the barn. The spring air was sweet with the scent of new grass and possibility. Wade. He looked up from his work, and she saw what he'd been crafting, a full-sized cabinet, beautifully made, with special compartments sized for sheet music and instrument care. "For the schoolhouse," he said gruffly. "Figured you needed proper storage for the music things." But she knew better, knew the hours he'd spent on each joint, the care in every carved detail. This wasn't just furniture. It was a declaration made in wood and patience. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He set down his tools, wiping his hands on a rag. "Eloise, I need to tell you something." Her heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it?" "I got a letter from a woman in Kansas Territory. Says she runs a boarding house there. Has a young woman working for her who plays the fiddle. Woman who talks about a sister in Missouri she hasn't seen in years." The world tilted. "Sarah!" "Description matches what you've told me. The place is about 3 days' ride from here." Eloise gripped the barn door for support. "Sarah, after all this time, a real lead." "I have to go." "I know." He moved closer, still maintaining that careful distance they'd both honored. "I've arranged things with Sheriff Nally. I can take a week away, if you'd like company on the road." She looked at him, this man who'd become essential to her days without her quite knowing how. 6 months of shared meals when they could manage them, of him walking her home from the schoolhouse, of playing music while he worked nearby. 6 months of learning that love could grow even in soil poisoned by past wrongs, if tended with enough patience. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that." 3 days later, they set out just after dawn. The burned prairie was now a sea of green and wildflowers, as if the earth itself was determined to prove that destruction was never the end of the story. They rode companionably, Wade leading a pack horse with supplies. That first night, camping under stars so bright they seemed touchable, Eloise finally spoke the words that had been building for months. "I forgive you." Wade, who'd been tending the fire, went still. "Eloise." "No, let me finish." She drew her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I forgive you because holding on to that anger was poisoning me, because you've shown every day since who you choose to be, because my father, for all his righteousness, would have wanted me to choose grace." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's why it means something." She moved to sit beside him, closer than she'd allowed herself in 6 months. "I've been writing to my father's cousin in St. Louis. He sent me some of Papa's journals. Do you know what he wrote about?" in those last weeks. Wade shook his head. Redemption. How every soul could be saved if they truly sought to change. How the greatest sin was denying someone the chance to prove they'd transformed. She laughed softly, sadly. He would have forgiven you, Wade, long before I could. I don't deserve. Stop! She placed her hand over his. We've both paid enough penance. Maybe it's time to try something else. He turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. What did you have in mind? Life, she said simply. Just life, together, if you'll have me. Instead of words, he lifted her hand to his lips, the gesture speaking everything that needed to be said. They found Sarah on the third day, serving meals in a respectable boarding house in Cedar Ridge. The reunion was tearful, complicated, full of accusations and apologies, and eventually exhausted understanding. Sarah had indeed escaped the medicine show, had built a new life, had even married a carpenter named Robert Chen, a Chinese man who'd won her heart with his gentle ways and beautiful furniture. I thought about writing, Sarah said that evening, as they sat in her small but neat parlor. But I was so angry at Papa, at you for not stopping him, at the world. She touched her own fiddle case, sitting in the corner. Music saved me too, in the end. Funny how that works. Mama always said it was the language everything understood. Eloise replied. Sarah studied Wade, who'd kept respectfully quiet during the sisters' reunion. This is him, then the one you wrote about. Eloise had sent one letter, just saying she was safe and teaching in Coal Bend. She hadn't mentioned Wade's past, the complex path that had brought them together. This is Wade, she confirmed simply. Sarah's assessment was long and frank. Finally, she smiled. Well, he looks at you like Robert looks at me, like you hung the moon and taught it to sing. Wade actually blushed, and Eloise felt her own cheeks warm. They stayed 2 days, the sisters rebuilding their bond, planning future visits. Sarah was happy, truly happy, with her husband and her music and her life. The medicine show was a dark memory transformed into strength. On the ride home, Wade was quiet until they reached the spot where they'd camped that first night. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and he suddenly reined in his horse. What is it? Eloise asked. He dismounted, came to help her down. Then, to her amazement, he knelt right there in the wildflowers and ash-enriched earth. I don't have much to offer, he began, his voice rough with emotion. A past that will always shadow us, a scarred body and a deputy's salary, but I've got these hands that will work every day to build you a good life. I've got a heart that's been yours since you played that first song in my barn, and I've got a promise that I'll spend whatever years God gives me trying to be the man you see when you look at me. From his pocket, he withdrew not a ring but something else. A simple wooden carving of a fiddle, perfect in miniature, hung on a leather cord. Eloise Morgan, he said, I can't give you back what was taken, but I can offer you tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after. Will you marry me? She dropped to her knees in front of him, not caring about propriety or her dress. I don't need you to give me back anything, she said through tears. The fire took my old life, yes, but it also brought me to you, and you. You gave me music again. You gave me hope. You gave me a love I never expected to find. Is that a yes? Yes, she laughed, crying at the same time. Yes, you wonderful, stubborn, patient man. Yes. He kissed her then, there in the middle of the burned but blooming prairie, with the sunset as witness and wildflowers as congregation. When they finally broke apart, he hung the wooden fiddle around her neck. I made it from wood salvaged from the old church, he said quietly. Figured something beautiful should come from those ashes too. They were married a month later in the new Coal Bend church, Sheriff Nally standing as best man. Sarah and Robert traveling from Kansas to attend. The whole town turned out, even Mrs. Fletcher dabbing her eyes and declaring she'd always known they were meant for each other. As they stood before the altar, Eloise thought about the journey that had brought them here, fire and loss, guilt and forgiveness, the slow rebuild of trust and the unexpected bloom of love. Her father's church had burned, but his belief in redemption lived on in the man beside her, in the community around them, in the music that still connected it all. "Do you, Wade, take this woman?" the Reverend began. "I do," Wade said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Today and always." "And do you, Eloise, take this man?" "I do," she whispered, then louder. "I do." Later, at the celebration, she played her fiddle while Wade attempted to sing. He was still terrible at it, but his enthusiasm made up for his lack of pitch. The whole town danced in the very street where they'd once whispered about propriety. And if anyone remembered the old scandals, they kept it to themselves. As the evening wound down, Wade led her outside where Tempest waited, now gentle as a lamb, decorated with ribbons for the occasion. "One more surprise," he said, helping her mount despite her wedding dress. They rode to his property, their property now, where he'd built an addition to the cabin. Not just a room, but a proper space for music, with windows facing the sunset and walls already lined with the instruments he'd been secretly collecting. "For teaching," he said, "and for playing, and for whatever songs we haven't discovered yet." She kissed him there in their new music room, thinking of all the metaphors about fire she'd lived through, destruction and purification, the burn of loss and the warmth of love, the ashes of yesterday and the spark of tomorrow. "I love you," she said against his lips. "Thank you for keeping me safe, even when I was burning." "Always," he promised. "Always." Outside, the prairie stretched endless under stars, scarred but healing, burned but blooming. And in a cabin at the edge of Coal Bend, two souls who'd found each other in the ashes made music and love and a life worth every flame they'd walked through to find it. Some fires destroy, others refine, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, they light the way home. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope it touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts about Eloise and Wade's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 for more tales of love, redemption, and courage from the American frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit the hype button to help more people discover these stories of the human spirit. Until next time, partners.